Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in Life with Mother by Clarence Day. This story is entitled Father Visits the War. Mother was only 8 years old in April 1861 when the Civil War started, but all her 4 brothers were older, and 2 of them went to the front. Brutus Stockwell, the youngest, was away at school in France. Alden, the eldest, was tied up in business in Cleveland, where the first shiploads of ore had begun to arrive from the Great Lakes. But Levi got a commission in the Navy and served under Farragut, and Norris was one of the youngest captains of infantry to march with Sherman through Georgia. All 4 brothers were lively by nature, athletic, red-headed men. The Stockwells lived in Ohio, the Days in New York, and in the 60s the 2 families never had heard of each other. Physically they were rather alike. Father was athletic and lively, and he had red hair too, but he was only 16 when the war began, and Grandpa didn't want him to go. Grandpa, though he had voted for Lincoln, had hoped that the war wouldn't come, and when it did come he was disgusted. But Grandpa was 50. Father wasn't disgusted. He was interested and pleased. He was working downtown in New York, in Gwynn and Day's office, the firm in which his elder brother was the junior partner. In the evenings when he came home from business, he sat by the lamp in his bedroom and made elaborate drawings of soldiers in one of his schoolboy notebooks. I found it among his papers years afterward. A thick, square, well-made old blank book full of sums in arithmetic and clippings from Civil War newspapers and drawings by Father of cannon and bearded zouaves. Father's patriotism, however, was tempered with humor, and he seems to have been extraordinarily tickled by the fun Grandpa made of top, lofty patriots. At any rate, he cut out many of the most biting articles that Grandpa kept publishing, and pasted them in the fat blank book alongside his own warlike drawings. When Father was 17, he decided to join the old 7th Regiment. It was characteristic of him to look over the ground before he did anything, and then do it in what he considered the very best way, and the 7th was generally regarded as the best in the country. Its ranks were full, he found at the armory, but vacancies occurred now and then, because as there was a shortage of officers in the new armies, the older members of the 7th, even the privates, were in demand for these jobs. It was about the nearest thing that they had in the 60s to an officer's training corps. Father put his name down on the waiting list and went back to his office. Half the best young men in New York wanted to get into the 7th. Even the newspapers in London had spoken admiringly of the world-renowned 7th Regiment. And when President Buchanan made a speech to them before the election of Lincoln, he had felt so moved that he said, "The stout, hardy, noble, and defiant look which you exhibit shows that in the day and hour of battle you would be at the very front." The 7th had tried to get to the very front when the war started. It had sprung to arms and gone to the defense of Washington as soon as Sumter was fired on. A week later, however, when all real danger to the city was over and plenty of other troops had arrived, the 7th felt that its object had been accomplished, and that it might as well go back home. At this point, the government asked it to enlist for 3 months in the army. This didn't seem fair to the 7th. They had been distinctly assured when they started that they would only be away for 2 weeks. They at once held a meeting, however, and voted on this. They decided to enlist as a body and to serve 30 days. When this 30-day period was over, the men entrained and came home. The quote-unquote lower classes made unpleasant remarks about their return, but the regiment was welcomed all the more warmly by all the best citizens. In 1862, when Stonewall Jackson burst into the Shenandoah Valley, it looked as though he might capture Washington. The government requested the 7th to help out again. By this time, Father had been elected a member. He got a leave of absence from Gwynn and Day and went off as Private in Company D. Unfortunately, at least from Father's point of view, Stonewall Jackson subsided, and instead of seeing action in the field, the 7th was put into barracks near Baltimore. And as though this wasn't bad enough, The Secretary of War then requested the regiment, instead of enlisting for 30 days this time, to stay for 3 months. Nobody liked the prospect of sitting there for 3 months in a barracks. Father wrote to his mother that his company had been sent to Mount Clair Station, where they slept in the open, and as it was damp and cold, he added, "I wish you would send me a colored nightcap and some cigars." It wasn't certain whether the regiment would be willing to stay on or not. "I don't think I could stay," Father wrote, "on account of my business, for I don't think Gwyn and Day could very well spare me for that long." He was 17 going on 18, and here he was already talking this way and smoking cigars. In his next letter, he sounds somewhat younger. "I hope it will be over with soon," he wrote, "as I shall not stay more than a month, but this is not saying I'm homesick, for I can get along very well. I received your box of things yesterday. The cake, etc., was very much appreciated in our mess, and also the lemons, with which I made some lemonade last night, and it tasted first rate, as I was very thirsty, and the water is not very good, being limey, which is not grammatically correct, but still will express what I wish to convey. About 12 o'clock night before last, it commenced raining, and rained all day yesterday in perfect torrents, and most of the last night. My tent got pretty well water-soaked, and commenced leaking, and in an hour or so the floor was as wet as thunder, and we had all to huddle together to keep dry, and even in that manner we got very damp. I tell you, Mother, boards are a perfect luxury. At least I thought so when we got our board floor up last Sunday, after sleeping 2 or 3 nights in wet straw. We have our tent fitted up very nicely. At the end opposite the door is a musket rack with a shelf on top. Then there are 2 bunks on each side, and one directly in front, in which I sleep. The bunks, by the by, consist of a knapsack for a pillow, and a blanket spread out on the floor. From the top of the tent we have suspended 2 shelves, one under the other, on which we put our dishes, and in the center we have a table, all of which we made ourselves, so we think a great deal of them on that account. I wish you would send some lemons, oranges, ginger snaps, cake, and if possible a nice pie, which last luxury I have not seen since leaving New York, also some cigars, as I have but 2 left, and some sugar. The sugar I would prefer to be ordinary brown sugar, rather than the kind you sent before. Those shoes are splendid, being large and easy. Hoping to hear from you soon. I am your aft son. On June 19th he wrote from Mount Clair Station, "We are to be sworn in this afternoon." And lower down he added, 4 hours later, "We are sworn in, and I am now nothing but a volunteer and a mudsill." Our company being on detached duty was sworn in by itself, the regiment being sworn in at the fort. There was but 1 man in our company who backed out, and that was Brundage. Those members who remained at home will be referred to the Adjutant General of the State of New York, and will be dealt with according to the law. As they had agreed to enlist for 3 months, Father added, "I suppose I have lost my situation at G&D's. Well, it is my sacrifice in this war. But I don't think that they are very patriotic, because most all in the other houses who have clerks in this regiment are saving their places for them and continuing their salaries. In regard to my washing, I get that done by women who come to the fort for it. I get down to the city once in a while and take a good bath and eat a good dinner, and altogether I manage to get along very well. Our rations are very short sometimes, and occasionally we have only bread and tea for supper. Today I was down to the house of Winans, the Secesh, with a member of our company, who is intimately acquainted with them. His family, Winans, are Union, but he is Secesh. While there I had some very nice cherries. Invited to come again. Hoping to hear from you very soon. Letters from home, no matter how short, are very great resource of gratification. I am your aft son." 3 days later his company got back to its barracks, and he found that box of things waiting. But I was very much disappointed on opening the box to find the pies all moldy, he wrote, and after eating 1 or 2 of them on top and coming to the 3rd or 4th, I couldn't go them, and even now the very negroes would not eat them, and I had to throw them away. In regard to the cigars Father sent, they were very acceptable indeed. I guess I shan't sell any of them, as I have plenty of room in my knapsack. Apparently cigars were not shared as freely as cigarettes are today. I have great trouble in keeping my dishes. I have none of them left except my plate that I brought away from New York. I have lost 2 or 3 sets of knives, forks, and spoons, and 1 cup. At present I am using a knife without a handle, and a fork with the tines broken half off. The pail which you sent the pies in comes very useful indeed, but I wish you had sent a whole saucer instead of that broken one. Fort Federal Hill, Baltimore, July 15th, 1862. Dear Mother, it is very hot indeed today, and was yesterday. Yesterday we had a long battalion drill, and the lieutenant colonel only stopped when one of the 8th Company was sunstruck, and several in different companies dropped from the heat. I did not go on drill, and would not go on such a hot day, and I expected to be put on guard today as a punishment, but was not, however, as there were too many of my opinion. Colonel Lefferts is absent, and Lieutenant Colonel Price is in command, and I think overuses his power, which I infer from the drill of yesterday, because if the colonel had been here, he would not have had any drill on such a scorching day. Those pickles you sent were very good indeed, and came very nice with dinner. Someone stole most all my cakes, and those crullers and cookies you sent, and I did not get more than 20 of the whole lot, and that had to go among 4 of us. Father's next letter was about Lieutenant Colonel Price, who, according to a contemporary record, was an obstinate little man with a shrill voice. He had been born in London. He was precise in his habits, and quick and erect in his movements. He wore a chin beard with no mustache, and he was in the real estate business. The boys are down on him, Father wrote. He either mistakes the men he has to deal with, or else wishes to show his power. But he will have to be pretty sharp to get ahead of the boys. Tonight he sent out some prisoners that were detained in the guardhouse for some petty offenses to haul down the flag at retreat. They hauled down flag, rope, and everything. The consequence is that it will take about half a day to fix it up again, and unless the boys have a mind to, they won't put it up, as they can't force any man to climb up such a high pole as that and endanger his life. Not in wartime. P.S., Father added, last night the boys collected around the colonel's quarters and sung sonnets of Lieutenant Colonel Price, which were not very complimentary to him. I just received Father's letter. Ask him to send me Pickwick Abroad or some good novel in paper covers. August 16th, 1862. Dear Father, I received your letter today enclosing $4 Baltimore money. Yesterday I was on guard, and I hope it will be the last time. Another steamboat load of wounded soldiers came up from Fort Monroe. If the Irish attempt any riot in New York, after a fair and impartial draft, I think they had better send the whole crowd of those concerned in the riot off to the war, whether they had been drafted or not. P.S. Instead of the Waverly, send the Sunday Times, and please send it Monday. A week or 2 later, the regiment's 3 months were over, and it came back to New York, and again it was welcomed with cheers, although not quite so warmly. In later years, when Mother came across these old letters of Father's, she spoke in quite a critical tone about them, much to his surprise. "Was that all you did, Claire?" she asked him at dinner one evening. "Didn't they call out the 7th again?" Father said yes, the 7th went south for about a month in 1863. But he and a lot of others had known better that time than to start, until they saw whether the regiment was going to barracks or battle. Wouldn't be worth their while to go, their idea was, unless there was a chance to see action, and when it turned out to be those same old Baltimore barracks, all these members stayed home. Mother said that her brothers hadn't been home except when they got furlough, and that even after Levi was captured he had got out of prison and gone back to his ship. Father replied that as for Levi and Norris, there was no reason why they shouldn't serve. They had nothing else to do, probably. As for himself, not only had he been busy at the office, but he had used common sense, and he had formed a poor opinion while in barracks of the way in which wars were run. He said that Mother was only a woman and knew nothing about it, and furthermore that nothing would have induced him to serve for 4 years unless they had let him take charge of things and run the damned war himself. Mother said she still couldn't understand what the 7th kept coming home for. Why didn't they stay down there and fight? As there didn't seem to be any answer to this that would satisfy her, Father closed the discussion by saying that so far as he was concerned, he was not a French peasant. He said that he was an American and didn't intend to serve as a pawn to be moved around a chessboard by anybody. He admired the farmers of Lexington and Concord, he said, who had swarmed out like a nestful of hornets, done their work and gone home, and he had done exactly the same at the first opportunity. He seemed to feel satisfied that he had made a very good hornet. Father's methods of courtship. It took Father 3 years to propose, Mother once told me. In the first place, he needed time to feel sure that he was in love. He had made one mistake before he even met Mother, and one was enough. Secondly, Mother was still a pupil at Miss Haynes' school at Gramercy Park. He couldn't marry a schoolgirl. The other difficulty was that she was rich, or at least she was the sister of one of the richest men he knew down on Wall Street. Alden Stockwell had a yacht and drove a four-in-hand. He engaged a private car when he traveled. He had a house on Murray Hill in New York and another in Mayfair in London. Father called him a nabob. Father was a prudent young man, and his objection to marrying the sister of a nabob was due to his belief that she would expect him to provide for her more luxuriously than he possibly could, or, in fact, than he had any intention whatever of doing. Meanwhile, Mother was being courted by other beaux, even before she left school. She had had 6 proposals of marriage by the time she was 20. One was from an elderly man who had known her as a child in Painesville, Ohio. Another was from her Sunday school teacher at a church in New York. Others still were from polite young New Yorkers who were fascinating but who frightened her by getting drunk. And one was from a wise and handsome foreigner, a Turco-Italian whom she felt attached to and trusted, but with whom, as he saw for himself, she really wasn't in love. She wasn't in love with Father either, she thought. He didn't behave right at all. As a little girl, she had sat on the step by Grandma's white picket gate and stared down the road and wished that a carriage would come dashing up for her and whisk her away. That wasn't at all the kind of thing she thought that a young man like Father would do. All her beaux, except Father, had offered her beautiful presents, so beautiful that they were sometimes returned. They were too much to accept. They had all sent her flowers. It had never occurred to Father, apparently, to offer her anything. She didn't know what to make of the man. He was too independent. Another provoking thing about him was that he didn't even pay her nice compliments. Yet somehow he had a kind of realness for her that the other men lacked. Early in 1873, something terrible happened. Her brother Alden had got into a financial contest with Mr. Jay Gould, and all of a sudden Alden had found himself outflanked and defeated. His losses ran into millions. He still had his home and his yacht, but his whole position was dangerous. He had been making elaborate plans for Mother's coming-out party. She was his only sister, and he was a widower. In spite of his losses, he generously went ahead with his program. It was a bitter cold night when the guests came, and Alden was a desperate man. But he was also a proud one. His beautiful home was festooned with roses till it was one mass of flowers. 2 orchestras played. The conservatory was filled with bright lanterns, and trays of jeweled favors were provided as souvenirs for the dancers. Not so very long afterward, a sheriff sat smoking in the hall where the orchestra had played the Blue Danube Waltz. The servants were hurrying to leave, joking over the bundles of things they had pilfered, and tradesmen were attaching the paintings and the chests of silver and plate. When that day came, Mother sat at the window upstairs and saw her own little ponies with their silver-mounted harnesses led away with her phaeton. But Alden, although he had been mortally wounded financially, was too strongly entrenched to topple over at once. His affairs and his assets were ramified. His ruin took time. Meanwhile, when the spring came, Mother was put on the train to Ohio, leaving behind her a brother who no longer smiled and who hardly spoke, but who would not acknowledge defeat. It was at this stage of affairs that Father asked Mother to marry him. When Great-Aunt Lavinia heard the news, she wrote to Grandma at once, strongly advising that she make Mother marry. "The Days are not rich," she said, "but they have always lived very comfortably." But Mother wasn't sure whether she was in love or not. She didn't know what to do. There was one thing she could do, however. She could tell Father to come out to Painesville. This was a test she had imposed on each of her suitors before taking them seriously, and it had been quite a help to her, and perhaps to them too. She felt that before she had made up her mind to spend her life with a man, he and she had better see each other in her old family home. Mother had grown up in Painesville. It had been settled by Vermonters and other New Englanders who had traveled in covered wagons to get there, late in the 1700s. Its quiet, broad, shady streets, its brick sidewalks, its white, colonial houses surrounded by trees, each with its own front lawn and garden inside of a white picket fence, made it one of the loveliest towns in the Western Reserve. But lovely as it was, in its own way, its standards of comfort were simple. The last previous suitor before Father who had come out to Painesville was a fashionable young man from New York who was wholly unused to small towns. He was dismayed by the service, the customs, and the limited fare of the town's one hotel. He was unprepared to have people stop and stare at him as he walked down the street. Being a mercurial youth, he had become so depressed by all this that he had got drunk, very drunk, in an effort to cheer himself up. This became known, like everything else in Painesville, and it had created a scandal. When he was sober again and realized what a sensation he'd caused, he apologized to Grandma and Mother for having disgraced them. Grandma said he had better apologize to himself, for he hadn't disgraced her and couldn't. He took the next train back to New York and immediately got drunk again. Mother didn't quite dare to marry a victim of drink, but she always kept a tender spot in her heart for this bewildered young man. She followed his later career half maternally, and she even kept track of his children. His weakness for drink turned out to be permanent, but it was more or less harmless too. He was so gay and sociable by nature that everyone liked him. His only trouble was that he was easily discouraged, and that he had no head for liquor. When Father arrived in Painesville, he behaved very differently from any of his predecessors. Whatever their private opinions of Painesville had been, they had been much too guarded to express them. Father expressed his at once. He told Mother, and he told Grandpa and Grandma Stockwell just what he thought of it. He said it was, quote, a damned hole, quote. The decent people of Painesville regarded it as needlessly profane to say damn, but in other respects they had no great objection to Father's frankness. In fact, it amused them. He seemed to be a clean, energetic, likable-looking young fellow, and all the time that he was in Painesville he did not, quote, touch a drop, end quote. He told Mother that this was merely because there was nothing in the place fit to drink, but the rest of the town didn't know this, and his sobriety and vigor impressed them. It even impressed Grandma a little. She and Father didn't get on well, then or later, but she had nothing against him, she said. He said he wouldn't leave until Mother had promised to marry him, and he urged her to hurry. In his next sentence, she found that although part of this was for ardor, the rest was impatience. He wanted to get out of Painesville. He said he should think that she'd want to get out of there too. They were married in New York in June. It was a small, quiet wedding. Only about a dozen of the family were present. It was held in Alden's big house. Alden was grave. He hadn't taken to Father. Immediately after the ceremony, the young bride and groom sailed for France. It had all been so sudden, just at the last, that Mother felt shaken up. The weather was rough. She took to her berth, and she stayed there, and when Father offered to bring her anything to eat, she begged him not to, and moaned. Father could not understand this. He had an excellent appetite himself, and he found the weather exhilarating. He urged Mother to get up on deck. She'd be all right in an hour or two, he assured her, if she'd, quote, make an effort, end quote. When this had no effect, he went off and filled his lungs with sea air and ate 3 hearty meals a day and felt very sorry for Mother. He kept trying to think of something that he could do for her to make her well again. One afternoon, ruddy and glowing, he opened their cabin door. "Vinny," he said, "aren't you feeling better yet? I wish you'd be with me at lunch." No answer. "I had 2 helpings of salmon," he added to tempt her, "and the sauce tartare was delicious." A vivid but most unwelcome picture sprang up in Mother's mind of that thick, too thick and greenish sauce oozing over a plate. She pulled herself together and begged him faintly, "Don't talk to me, darling, just now." He returned to the upper deck, mystified, and smoked a cigar. It was nearly a year, Mother once told me, before she could bear to eat salmon with or without sauce tartare. Neither of them had been in Paris since the German armies had come and gone again. They found it was crowded. The Shah of Persia and his glittering court were the guests of the government. A whole hotel had been reserved for their use, and the city was being given over to illuminations and fetes. That hotel had to be specially fumigated afterward, Father used to observe, when Mother was describing the splendor of Paris that season. Every now and then, as they were walking along, there was the sound of galloping horses, and the Shah's outriders dashed down the street, followed by the Shah himself in his great open carriage, and the music of trumpets. Mother was thrilled, but Father said it would take more than a Shah to thrill him. He said the Shah was a nuisance. One night, when there was to be a grand display of fireworks in the Bois, Mother insisted on going, so after dinner they drove out there in their evening clothes, and both of them enjoyed it immensely until it came time to go back, and they found that they could not get a carriage. Even then it was all right at first, walking along the Champs-Élysées, but Mother's evening slippers were so thin, and their hotel, the Grand Hôtel de l'Ante, was so far away that Father had to keep stopping to let Mother rest, and at last, when the slippers had given out completely, and he found that she was trying to keep up with him in her stocking feet, he had to carry her. Mother was so tired by this time that she willingly let him, hoping he would feel that bearing his young bride in his arms was romantic, and possibly he might have thought so if the distance had only been less. But as he went on and on, she didn't get any lighter, and Father began to remember that he hadn't wanted to come. He felt sorry for Mother, and he loved her, but he could not keep wholly still, and as he staggered on, stray passers-by heard him denouncing the Shah. It was to be over 20 years before they ever went to Europe again. When they got back late in the summer and Mother went on for a visit to Newport, where Alden, who was braving things out to the last, had taken a house for the season, a telegram from Father suddenly summoned Mother back to New York. The Great Panic of 1873 had started. The post-war prosperity of America was crashing in ruins. Nobody knew or could guess what was coming, and he wanted her there at his side. This is the end of Part 2 of Life with Mother by Clarence Day. In the next video, we will continue with the story entitled Grandpa Assists at a Seance. Thank you for listening.